Hey guys, welcome to my podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite movies growing up, which was Disney's 1973 animated Robin Hood film with all of the little animals playing the characters. This was always just a really fun movie for me growing up. I watched it all the time, but today, as an adult, I decided to watch it again, but through an academic lens after taking a class on medieval gender and power. And I wanted to kind of figure out where these characters actually landed in real life, in real medieval history. And I do say real life with kind of a grain of salt because some of these characters, as we'll talk about later, weren't really real, or it's debated how real they were. But in my most recent rewatching of this, I read a lot about the characters' real life, again, counterparts, and some journal articles and stuff, as well as I went back and read some medieval letters. And so today I'm just going to be talking about the movie through this lens and how it represents medieval people and medieval culture and history. So first I want to talk about Robin Hood. He is, of course, the titular character. He's the protagonist. He is probably one of our most famous medieval heroes. He is very popular. There's tons of media out there about him, which is really interesting because, like one of the articles I read was talking about, he, unlike lots of other medieval heroes that are less famous, he is probably not a real person throughout time, but rather a representation of many different men throughout time. And this sort of reflects a cultural fascination with the idea of the outlaw, or someone who exists outside of regular society. It's also really interesting that he is the hero we see most often because in modern day, he would probably be considered a terrorist. You don't see this, of course, in the children's movie, but he is like killing and robbing landowners and using guerrilla warfare against the sheriff of the time, which is a character in the movie, so there's that there. But I think this is really interesting that this is the figure that has stood the test of time and remained very famous, and kind of reflects our obsession with that kind of person, like I said before, the person who has all these adventures and doesn't have to follow society's rules per se. And I think that's really interesting. Next, we have Maid Marian. She is, of course, in this movie, Robin Hood's love interest. They do get married at the end. Spoiler alert, the movie's been out for 52 years, so not really worried about spoiling it. Also, the story of Robin Hood is pretty well known by now, if you have a general sense. And it's actually really interesting because she was not a part of the Robin Hood folklore until about the 15th century, when Robin Hood was shown to be a part of the May Games, which are this festival that took place in medieval time in order to welcome in spring. And from there, after this point, after the 15th century, she became a staple in the Robin Hood story, though the exact nature of their relationship did shift and change over time. Of course, in the movie, they do get married, and that is kind of the typical idea that she is a love interest, which I think does reflect the human tendency to add romantic interest to these stories. This is something we see all the time in modern day, but it also reflects that that's kind of always been a thing. We've kind of always felt the need to add a romantic story to any sort of story that we have, whether it's more prominent or whether it's a subplot. Either way, that is a very human tendency. Similarly to Maid Marian, we have Friar Tuck, who also joined the folklore of Robin Hood around the same time, and once again, now they are very intertwined. He's very associated with Robin Hood, even though it didn't start out this way. I think in this movie, he reflects the religious culture of the time. Everyone was kind of very religious. It was very socially expected to be religious, much less than it is today. And you see more religion like that in older children's films. I feel like you don't get it as much anymore, particularly with Disney movies. But I think him and Maid Marian together also reflect the way that stories and folklore change over time. I have these stories that have been passed down through like people telling the stories rather than written, and then eventually they become written and performed and everything, and we have more solid record of them. But these stories do change over time, and while we might think that the Robin Hood story we know today is the same almost pretty much as it was when it originated hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it probably is not, and that goes for a lot of these stories. And I think that's really interesting and really relevant to the way we think about these stories and how they're interpreted and how they change for modern audiences. Finally, I'm going to talk about a woman who, though she is not an actual character in this film, she does have a very large presence, and that is Eleanor of Aquitaine. And her two sons are Prince John and King Richard. Prince John, throughout the movie, is kind of hated. He's the antagonist, and they're kind of like making fun of him the whole time. There's that whole song in the middle where they sing about how he's the phony king of England because he has taken over the role of king, as his brother, King Richard I, is on crusades, which did actually happen. And King Richard is pretty beloved by the people of England, and Prince John is hated, which is pretty reflective of how it actually happened. And then when King Richard comes back into power, everyone celebrates. Robin Hood can kind of let go of some of his adventuring and stealing from the rich and giving to the poor in order to go get married and have kids. So it kind of reflects a very positive political culture once King Richard comes back into power. But from these two, we get Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she is never mentioned by name. But Prince John is, in his moments where he seems really pathetic, he is crying to his mama. And he also talks about, in the beginning of the movie, how Richard was always mama's favorite. And throughout the movie, Prince John clearly craves her love and approval, but does not really get it. And so she kind of looms over this film, especially when you know who she is. She has a very large presence in this movie. Despite not being an actual character, she never appears. She's never mentioned by name. But this reflects her great power that she had and her presence throughout history. I went back and I read some of the old letters from King Richard to his mother that he wrote from captivity, and these are what clearly show that she has a lot of power. He begs her to use that power for his own political reasons. He pushes for the election of Hubert as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He very much appeals to her power. It's very clear that she has a lot of power, even though he's the king, technically. He wouldn't be writing to her like this if she didn't have the power. He describes himself as a devoted son, and he expresses a lot of gratitude for her. And I think it's really interesting how we get this figure of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is not even named, once again, in the film at all, other than being referred to as mother. But she was such a large presence throughout history, and she had such a great role around this time that the film, despite not having her as a character, could not exist, really, without her. And I think that's really interesting and speaks to her power a lot, and speaks to how influential she was. So I think that when we look at all these characters like this and their roles in history and in the folklore of Robin Hood, we kind of get a sense that though this is a children's movie, there is a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of the characters, the roles these characters all played throughout history. It also reflects on some parts of medieval culture in a way that gives children an understanding, even if they don't really truly understand what it is. It gives them a general idea and kind of the sense of what's going on. And maybe like me, it'll spark a greater interest for them later on. But thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope you enjoyed. I hope maybe you learned something. And I hope to see you again next time.